Hi guys, and welcome to the Breeders' Cup. I was going to do something a little different from Tom. Tom's a tough act to follow. He was very impressive. I was going to talk a little bit more about my experience with the Breeders' Cup and the horses that I've trained towards it. The Breeders' Cup is without a doubt my favorite weekend. I love to point horses for this weekend, and I've been very fortunate in that respect. The first year that I took horses to the Breeders' Cup was in 2004 in Texas, and that still remains probably my favorite memory. It was all very new to me. I went with my wife and 3 horses and 1 groom. Actually, one of my grooms was arrested within 2 days of being there, which I didn't even know. He wasn't a legal citizen. So I got off on a very bad foot. So we ended up with just my wife and I and 1 backup person. I had 3 horses. The first one I had was Dance Away Capote, who was a 2-year-old filly who came to me from a new owner. And actually, when he sent the filly to me, he told me that she'd be a Breeders' Cup runner back in the spring when he first sent her to me, which I thought he was absolutely crazy. But sure enough, here we were in the Breeders' Cup at Lone Star. She ran very well, finished 4th. Got off to a credible start. The second filly I ran that day was a filly called Filmmaker, who was a filly that had been my first Group 1 winner. She won the Queen Elizabeth at Keeneland, and was really a filly that had put me on the map. I think these horses that get you to these big races are the horses that really help your career, and they give so much for us and get us to these fantastic races. So Filmmaker ran in the filly and mare turf that day at Lone Star. She finished 2nd. I was so disappointed when Johnny came back after the race and we'd just been beaten by Ouija board. And Johnny said, "What's wrong? What's wrong? You were 2nd in the Breeders' Cup." I was like, "I know, but we came so close. Didn't know that I'd have another chance." As it was, Filmmaker went on to run the next 3 years. Each time, Ouija board finished ahead of her. So if she could have come around at any other time other than the years that Ouija board was running, she definitely could have won one. So by the time we'd run Filmmaker and the filly and mare turf, Better Talk Now was next up. I remember being in the paddock that day at Lone Star and looking up at the tote board, and he was 27-1. And I thought, well, the pressure's off. We can just enjoy the rest of the day. And sure enough, he won the race. We had to survive a 5-minute foul claim, which was very stressful. For Ramon and I, Ramon, who gave him an incredible ride that day, I think he was really the horse that got our careers going. He was a horse that, winning the Breeders' Cup Turf that year, sort of brought attention to our stable, gave owners confidence to send us more horses. And I'd like to think it very much was the same for Ramon. I think he was a career-changing horse, and for that I'm forever grateful. He went on to run 5 more times in the Breeders' Cup, which has got to be close to a record if it's not. He was obviously a very special horse for me. In 2006, when we came back to Churchill 2 years later, both he and Filmmaker were 2nd. Filmmaker was 2nd to Ouija board. Better Talk Now was 2nd to Red Rocks in what was probably one of my toughest beats. It's a race that I'll never forget. You remember the wins, but you really remember the tough losses. And that was a tough beat for Red Rocks that day. I always felt that if Better Talk Now could have won the Breeders' Cup a 2nd time, he perhaps would have gone down in the history books and earned a little bit more recognition than he did. But as it was, he was still a remarkable horse. He ran till he was 10. He lived out his years at Fair Hill. Unfortunately, we had to put him down last year after a bout of colic. But he never left my stable at Fair Hill, and had a huge impact, obviously, on my career. The next time we came back to Churchill was in 2010. I had a mare called Shared Account for Kevin Plank, Sagamore Farms, and she ran disastrously in the prep race for the Breeders' Cup. Actually, I remember Kevin turning to me that day and saying, "I need to go see a football match." And I thought, oh boy, we're in trouble here. Anyway, I talked him into coming to the Breeders' Cup. I think she was 45-1 that day. got a tremendous ride by Edgar Prado. Again, she was such an influential horse for me, a horse that, you know, when you compete in these races, you continue to earn respect, and people have more confidence to send you another good one. By the way, the day before the Breeders' Cup, she actually dropped her rider, and Bill Mott caught her for me, which was a little anecdote. So it just goes to show that anything can happen on any given day. People always say, coming up to the Breeders' Cup, aren't you excited? And I'm like, I'll be excited when I get there. You know, so many things can happen leading up to the races that it's hard to get excited till you're actually there in the paddock. The next memorable Breeders' Cup for me was 2012. I had a horse called Animal Kingdom who had won the Derby for me here the year before. He'd been injured in the Belmont, completing the Triple Crown that year, and he had been off the rest of the year, came back as a 4-year-old, and ran in, I believe, won an allowance race at Gulfstream, at which point we were going to point him for the Dubai World Cup. Unfortunately, the next breeze he had before going to Dubai, after his win at Gulfstream, he was injured again. And obviously it was hugely disappointing. This was the best horse I'd ever trained. He belonged to Team Valor, as many of you know, Barry Owen. And I remember saying to Barry, maybe a month or so after he'd been injured, you know, what I'd really like to do with this horse is point him for the Breeders' Cup. And I thought he would think I was absolutely crazy, but fortunately Barry went along with my madness. He never said much about it. And we pointed him for the Breeders' Cup at Santa Anita. I thought it was a great idea until I actually got to California with him, and then I really thought I was crazy, coming in off an 8-month layoff. But he ran a remarkable race, probably personally one of my best accomplishments as a trainer, perhaps, getting him to the Breeders' Cup off an 8-month layoff. He ran second to Wise Dan, who I think was winning it for the second time. Didn't have a great trip, but came out of the race well, went on to win the Dubai World Cup. Just a phenomenal horse for me, for my career, a horse that I owe so much to. 2 years later, I was back at Santa Anita with a horse called Main Sequence. He'd been a tricky horse in England. He'd been a very good 3-year-old. I think he was 3rd in the English Derby. I spoke to David Lanigan a lot about him, who trained the horses for Maria, for the Niarchos family. He'd been a little bit of a tricky horse in the gate, and actually David had worried that one day he might not come out of the gate. He was getting so naughty about it. So we spent a lot of time helping him with that, trying to help him to come away from there in good order, because it was going to cost him races. He went on to win 3 Group 1s that year, came to the Breeders' Cup at Santa Anita. Unfortunately, Rajiv Murrah, who'd been riding him, had been injured a month before and was not able to ride him. Johnny gave him a remarkable ride. It was probably the day that Main Sequence really put it together, broke away from the gate very cleanly, and was able to give me my second win in the Breeders' Cup turf. Again, just an extraordinary horse that I owe so much to. Last year, I came back with a 2-year-old called Untamed Domain, who was a son of Animal Kingdom. Kind of feel to me like it's almost coming back full cycle, running a horse by the best horse that I ever trained. He ran a creditable second, had a tough trip at Del Mar, but just the fact of getting back with a son of Animal Kingdom was a big thrill for me. So all these horses have just had a huge influence on me. I think, you know, there are a lot of good trainers out there, but you need to have good horses to attract good horses and good owners, and I've been very fortunate in that respect. I ran a couple of long shots on Saturday, a filly called Varenka in the 2-year-old fillies on the grass, who again will be a long shot, but I think time has shown that in the Breeders' Cup you can take a chance, and often long shots will come home. So this is a tremendous weekend. It's my favorite week of the year. I hope you guys really enjoy it as much as I do. Thank you very much.